Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are. Thanks very much for joining us today for the latest of OAG's webinars. It's good to have so many of you joining again. We're seeing a lot of regular names in the registrations, so thanks for coming back and thank you for joining us if you're new today. The webinar today will be recorded and you'll be sent a recording usually about an hour after we finish, and the slides and the recording will be available on the OAG website afterwards. As we go through the chat and discussion today and our slides, please do ask questions using the chat feature. We usually seem to take those as we go, so we'll try and answer as many questions as we can as we're running through the slides. So keep your questions coming in. We're very happy to take them. The subject today is summer holidays. I'm aware that that's really a very northern hemisphere type of way of looking at the world, but we're really trying to look forward to the third quarter, the summer period for the Northern Hemisphere, and looking at the airlines. Where are they headed? Are we looking at summertime blues or a bit of sunshine? So we'll be looking particularly at international schedule capacity in some key international markets. We're going to be looking at where airlines traditionally have got their revenues from and what that might mean for them. And we're also going to be looking at some of the experimentation that we're seeing with new routes that are being operated and why that's happening. So to join me today, we have Matt Findlay. Thanks very much for joining us, Matt. You're in Nelson Bay in New South Wales, aren't you, today?
Correct. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Matt comes with lots of experience of airports and the aviation industry, so we're really looking forward to his contribution, particularly helping us with understanding the Tasman bubble, I think, today, and some of the things we're seeing in Asia particularly. We've also got John Grant with us, as usual, speaking to the OAG data in particular. John, you write a blog for OAG every week, and this week the image was of a man with his head in his hands. I think you said it's been a mad week, hasn't it?
It has, Becca. Hi, everyone. It's such a mad week, Becca, that you haven't put the slides up yet, so none of us can see them. So if you could do that, that would be helpful as well.
Can't see the slides?
No, none of us can see the slides, so I don't know what you've done there.
I'm seeing the slides.
No one else can.
John's is when you sing.
Oh, I apologise. I realised what's happened. Can you see them now?
Yep, we're all here now.
Okay.
Matt, you're looking good.
I do need my apologies. Let me go back. If I can go back 2 slides, you can see what I've. There's the title slide, and there's our themes for today, what we're going to be talking about, and here we've got our 3 speakers. I do apologise for that. First time that was happened, they won't let me forget it. No, John, a mad week in aviation.
Absolutely crazy. I mean, it's a crazy industry at the best of times, but some of the things we are seeing, it's in some ways I can understand putting your head in your hands and being depressed, and in others, you know, there are so many exciting developments and things happening that we'll discuss in the next hour or so. So it's completely and utterly fascinating, but you know, at the end of it all, I just wonder how much of what we are seeing will really still be there in 5 years' time as we've come out of this recovery. You know, there's lots of exciting new routes starting, lots of startup airlines, but the big boys are very big and very strong and very resilient, and it's extremely hard to find a space for new entrants in this industry. So let's work our way through the data and discuss in more detail.
That's great. I'm looking forward to hearing some of your usually controversial points, John. So let's start with looking at some of the OAG data. We show this data in some form or other at the beginning of each of our webinars. On the left, we've got monthly data, and on the right, it's the last 8 weeks of data. On the left, just try not to confuse you, but we're now just looking at each month. So on the left, we've got May 2020 versus the same month, but in 2019. So on the right of the chart, we've got April, that's also versus April 2019, just because we're getting into that period where last year we were seeing capacity fall very sharply, and year over year percentage changes are less easy to understand when we see them all together. So that's just versus the same month in 2019. John, where's the trend here? Are we seeing
the biggest trend, I think, Becca, is that the whole of Europe is getting left behind in terms of any sort of recovery. There are some bright spots, as I commented in my blog on Sunday, when Africa is the leading region for capacity growth week on week, then the rest of the world has a bit of a problem, even though it was only a couple of thousand seats. And we are still seeing some parts of the world where capacity is being cut quite dramatically. Lower South America is a great example, where essentially Brazil continues to fight another round of COVID spikes. And yet North America, and particularly the United States, is going gangbusters. There is no other way to describe the growth in domestic capacity we've seen in the last couple of months. And Florida is close to probably sinking with the weight of all the new air services into places like Miami, Fort Myers, and even Orlando, where there's just so much growth taking place. And of course, next week we have the exciting development that Matt's looking forward to in the TASMAN bubble reopening, and I think it's 19,000 seats next week. But we're still a long way from where we were in January 2020, with about 58% of normal capacity being operated. And as I keep saying, that's capacity, that is not actual demand. And we're certainly not, in most cases, experiencing load factors of plus 80% on any services, which used to be the industry norm. So it's a very soft market at this moment in time, and yet, Becca, I'm staggered by the amount of optimism we continue to see in Western Europe about the summer being extremely strong, and demand picking up really quickly. So it will be fascinating to see if that hope is realised and the demand does return quicker than I personally expect.
I mean, certainly sitting here in the UK, it's not looking good, is it? We've seen more uncertainty about opening from the UK, and as a result, the likes of Jet2 over the last week have pulled quite a lot of capacity. They were planning on a 17th of May opening, and now it's pushed back towards the end of June, isn't it?
Yeah, we bought in the UK. We bought a traffic light system without any light bulbs. It's an absolutely ludicrous situation we find ourselves in, and it's embarrassing, I think, for anyone who's on the government's aviation task force to say they have any interest in commercial aviation and the future of the UK industry. It's an abysmal situation we face here at the moment when
it seems to be an illusion of opening, doesn't it, with very expensive PCR tests, which will actually dampen demand even if it is there.
Yeah, and good to see Willie Walsh has taken 13 days to make his mark in IATA and rightly comment that there should be no need for VAT to be charged on such goods, but we wait and see. But it's just not the UK, and in Western Europe, of course, we've still got Germany that's facing some pretty serious issues. France, of course, where yesterday we heard that they've approved the concept of migrating from domestic air services to train services, unless you happen to be on a connecting flight. I'm sure Air France are delighted by this development because it means their services will be protected, whilst the likes of EasyJet and others are discriminated again by the French in the domestic market.
Perhaps unintended consequences there.
Absolutely. Well, I hope it is the law of unintended consequences.
Right. And what we're seeing, I mean, I guess overall, this is a picture we've talked about a lot over the last year. Where there's domestic markets, where they're large, they're proving more resilient. And this is, what we're seeing in Europe is really a problem of international travel, isn't it? And that's why we're focusing particularly on international travel today.
It is, but I thought we had a single market in Europe for most countries. Clearly, when it comes to air travel and borders, that's not quite the case.
Yeah. Let's have a look at one more slide with some OAG capacity data. The black line here shows capacity globally for 2019 in the second quarter, but it's not second quarter. It's for the whole of 2019. And then the grey line was last year. We see the big drop in April. And then the yellow line, the dotted one, is this year's capacity now, and the solid yellow line is this year's capacity as it was a month ago. So this isn't a pattern we're unfamiliar with, is it? There's capacity taken out in the short term and capacity added a bit further out. So a bit less capacity through May and June and more capacity in September, which sort of looks perhaps unrealistic. We're not seeing anything new, are we? This is a year on and we're still seeing airlines behaving in the same way with no better ability to plan ahead, it seems.
Absolutely. And, you know, many airlines are only looking 2 or 3 weeks out. There is one major Scandinavian airline that is also a recognised specialist division of the UK Army, or has the abbreviation that's very similar, that thinks it's going to operate 380,000 seats in 2 weeks' time and is currently operating 70,000 seats. So, you know, airlines are at best looking maybe 2 or 3 weeks out. I think what's worrying here, Becca, and it goes to this thing about this, you know, the whole confidence and the expectation that things are going to get better, is that it's almost a like-for-like swap out that we're seeing in the next couple of weeks of April and May as to what is then subsequently being loaded back in the last 2 or 3 weeks of August and into early September. So, you know, it's almost like we're just shifting sands here or shifting capacity, and if the demand doesn't follow, then we're going to see that come down. I personally can't see us getting anywhere near 100 million scheduled seats a week by the 27th of September. I think it will shave down to perhaps 80 if we're really fortunate and things go well from here onwards.
And we've not talked about it so much recently, but you know, a year ago we were talking a lot about what this means for travellers and having bookings that then don't happen, flights are cancelled. As somebody who's still got an unresolved issue from a flight in March last year with a certain major British carrier, this is not good for passengers, is it? They're going to be even if there was demand and they wanted to travel, there's a real wariness about booking, isn't there? Knowing that.
And I looked at the OAG data snapshot for last week and compared it with this week's, which I think is always a useful barometer of where things are going. And there were some major airlines that were cancelling 20% of their flights in the last 7 days before travel. Now, for a traveller, you're probably better gambling on a Grand National horse being ridden by a lady winning for the first time ever in 2021. Flights are just getting cancelled with such frequency, and I completely sympathise with the airlines, because without the clarity that the governments fail to give us, this picture is going to continue, and it's going to frustrate everyone and damage confidence.
Okay, let's Matt, shall I bring you in? Is there anything you'd like to add there on this sort of global picture?
Yeah, look, from a down under perspective, if you will, or Asia Pacific, it's ironic that the 2021 number on the slide that you're showing at the moment is 10 to 20%, roughly speaking, below 2019. I think until you get a global reopening of markets, you're going to have this proportion of traffic not able to be serviced, and I think that's going to be the case, for an extended period. More recent days here, we've had some very disappointing news in regards to, even though the vaccine may be widely distributed here, whatever vaccine that might be, travel internationally might still not be permitted well into 2022. And if Australians aren't permitted by their government to travel abroad without exception, with only exception I should say, then you can only imagine there could be limited travel opportunities for those to travel to Australia. And as the Tasman bubble opens from next week, that might also mean that the likes of New Zealand and any other nation that might bilaterally join that bubble, there could be significant limitations going forward for a whole raft of markets. So the 2021 number that sits there as a dark yellow line may continue to sit below that for some period.
Becca, I think Matt makes a great point. You know, it's extremely hard getting out of this mess if you've a country that's been impacted by COVID and you've tried to impose travel restrictions and you've opened and you've closed and you've flexed and bent. But it's even harder to get out of this situation where you are a country that was in complete lockdown, because you know you've got to start that journey somewhere, and the risk attached to that, or the perceived risk, just creates a new phrase, an abundance of caution, whatever that means.
I think we know what that means. Okay, let's thanks very much, Matt and John. Let's move on and have a look in a little bit more detail about some of the international capacity flows that we're seeing. So bearing in mind that as we look forward to July, there's probably more capacity in the schedule than we expect to operate, or maybe it will, maybe it won't. This is looking at intra-Europe international capacity. So we've got a number of country pairs there, some of the major markets across Europe for air travel. And you can see at the top the July 2021 capacity we're seeing in the schedule at the moment for the month. The middle table here is 2019, and then this is the percentage change. So you've got a sense of both the size of the markets and also where it is versus 2 years ago. Spain, UK, not surprisingly, has the most capacity planned for July. John, is there any particular sort of observations here that we can draw from you know what is happening, where we think demand is, or how airlines are
clearly Russia isn't very popular for anyone, which probably isn't a surprise. But you know, it points to, again, as always, the size and scale of some of these country markets. And as you said, Becca, obviously UK, Spain is a very, very large market, and potentially 11 million seats in 2019, perhaps 9 million this year. You know, so even very strong markets where we're expecting rapid bounce backs are extremely cautious in the amounts of capacity, and across the whole of the European arena, we must remember that there are some airlines, quite large airlines, who were operating that will not be operating this summer. Norwegian being just one example, certainly not in the size and scale that they had before. But I think it just highlights how difficult this is as an industry to recover the complexity of flows between countries, and what those volume numbers are. It's you know, Germany, Spain is another one that was nearly 7 million, and that's potentially only going to be 5 million. So yeah, there's a lot of capacity that's been taken out, and we're still waiting to see what happens with demand.
I know you commented about Russia being down a lot, but the Russia, Turkey, Russia, Ukraine, we're seeing, you know, capacity much stronger there. I know when we was talking prior to the webinar today, Matt, you were saying we should be looking perhaps at Aeroflot and Turkish Airlines, because they actually may come out of this quite well, and as a result they may be stronger in terms of connecting between Europe and Asia. Is that right?
Yeah, look, there could be some opportunities there for those that have these very strong hubs that connect these, you know, unique city pairs. But I'm actually of the view at the other end of the spectrum, really. Here's a good argument. And the reason for that is people will want to avoid, in fact, let's take a step back here. You know, why is Florida so popular? Why is it that, you know, ski destinations and beach destinations are so popular? And I think one of the reasons is that consumers have this mindset that if they're going to be crammed inside a museum or a casino, or, you know, something that where you're in a confined space, there's a risk there of some sort of transmission. Now, whether that's a perceived risk or reality is another thing. But certainly consumer sentiment research that's been done in the US has pointed to a strong desire to have those holidays or escapes in places where you can spread out a bit more. And so a beach is a perfect location, right? Which is why Florida has boomed. But the reason why it's boomed also is because all these unique city pairs have suddenly been created. So I think, you know, airlines that have hubs will need to work harder to give the perception of safety in moving through those hubs, whilst airlines that can adjust and operate point-to-point services, which a lot of US carriers have started to do, and we begin to touch on that later in this presentation. You know, I think there's opportunities whereby you could see Turkish and other carriers that have relied upon their hubs reducing or pulling down some of those hubs and actually flying more point-to-point services that serves a more cautious and you know, significant market segment that wants to take a leisure break, but do so carefully. But also, in some respects, because the airlines are not in the driving seat in all of this, you know, they're taking directives from government, and you know, they're responding to where there are pockets of demand, and pockets of demand are existing in places that you know, may not have been on the radar in the past because there's other, you know, larger fish to fry, if you will. And so again, you know, airlines succeed in fishing where the fish are, and that's where pockets of demand exist.
And it's interesting you say that, Matt, because in the United States, in July, looking at some data yesterday, the 2 of the 5 fastest growing US states for capacity are Montana and Wyoming. Now, you know, they're not classic destinations. It may well be local residents heading to Florida, but equally, you know, some of that is hub capacity that is going into these states that previously was not there. And, you know, it's the wide open spaces, as you say, that off the beaten track type destinations that have an opportunity, at least in the short term.
Yep. Okay, we've got the same sort of data for intra-Asia. I wanted to ask both of you, what can destinations themselves do to try and help encourage travel? We've seen, you know, some initiatives like in Phuket, vaccinating everybody to try and, you know, make it a COVID secure, COVID safer, more attractive destination. Are there other initiatives you're seeing that help, you know, reinforce that idea that this is a safe place? You know, the more outdoor ones, you said the ski, the sun, Montanas or whatever. Are there actually initiatives that tourism bodies are able to take?
I think a lot of it, Becca, is about being ready and being prepared, and providing as much support as can be provided. And, you know, I think good examples of that will be if holiday makers are required to have a PCR test or some sort of test before they return home, having those facilities in destination resorts rather than in you know, insisting that people are going to have to travel 70 or 80 miles on their holiday in each direction and then pay a large amount of money for a PCR test. Making sure that the right processes are in place at the airport, and that, you know, we use as much biometric data as possible, so we reduce those moments of human contact and risk of infection. So it's about being prepared and communicating that you are prepared, I think, in many of these destinations.
Yeah, I tend to agree. The other thing about this is, and look, there's examples here locally down under. French Polynesia, for instance, opened up and you know, again, then had to unfortunately close again. They're looking to reopen again from 1 May, and they did open successfully. You know, there's different ways in which different nations and destination attractions, destination marketing boards, I should say, are you know, focusing on ensuring safety of travellers, and the challenge is trying to find a consistent approach so that you know, it's scalable for smaller destinations, but also recognisable by travellers, so that there's you know, an ease of using something that's familiar.
Okay, we've had quite a few questions coming in about vaccinations, but we're not we've still got a very sort of disparate approach to this, haven't we? We're not seeing vaccination rates yet reflected in where we're seeing capacity. We're not seeing sort of consistency about whether it's about testing or it's COVID passports that allow people to travel. There's still sort of a bit of a disconnect, isn't there, between what we do with testing, vaccinations and so on, and what that means for capacity. These sort of numbers and where we're seeing flights are really being driven by, in as much as they're driven by anything, by wishful thinking and government restrictions, isn't it?
We are, but at the same time, you know, there have been 5 standout countries in terms of numbers of people vaccinated, and as a proportion of, you know, the whole population base. United States, as I think it's over 35 million people, 300 million people been vaccinated or something. But you've got United States, United Kingdom, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Chile, although that seems to have been going backwards in the last couple of weeks. And bizarrely, Becca, as I think I've noted before, you know, suddenly there's a corridor between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Who would have thought that this time last year? And Etihad are flying, Wizz Air are flying, Emirates are going to fly. Everyone's going to fly between their hubs and Tel Aviv.
So have we got prospects of a US-UK corridor, do you think, given
I think so, but I think we do. I think the biggest challenge there is just the geographic size of the United States and the various rates of infection we still have in some of those states. You know, Florida is the #1 go-to state for the United Kingdom for holiday makers, and yet it still has a very high rate of infection per capita. So, you know, it's definitely on the cards, and I know that there's a lot of demand for it. And as we know, the transatlantic for the legacy airlines is traditionally where they make 50%, 60% of their profit, and they've been without that and without the cash for 15 months now. They are desperate for it to come back.
So it's a good point about where their revenue comes from. We've got a slide on that in a couple ahead, but we've got one for intra-Asia now, looking at capacity by airline, and then the next slide we're going to have a look at some of the revenues. So we split this out by on the left international, on the right domestic, just to see these are the biggest carriers in July 2019, and then you can see with the yellow bar where they are for capacity now. Massive difference, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Domestically, the Chinese carriers just dominate.
Yeah, and be very, very careful about this, because I think as much as anything else, this data demonstrates that airlines haven't even started to think about their international capacity in July, and there's a likelihood that a lot of that is going to come out. You know, Cathay Pacific not running anywhere near that capacity at the moment. Singapore Airlines nowhere near that. The only one that perhaps looks reasonable is Thai Airways, because quite frankly they're in danger of no longer operating the way the business is performing. So there's a lot of stuff still to come out here, and that sort of goes back to some of the slides we were showing a few moments ago.
And are some of these flights that we're seeing, are they actually freight rather than passenger traffic? Are they holding slots for freight flights? Potentially.
Obviously Emirates and Qatar Airways, Etihad and others are doing a lot of cargo flying in Asia. And for some of them it's been extremely profitable. But yeah, it's a bit of an overstatement, I think, of where we're going to be come July.
This is an interesting slide, actually, because I mean it says here that Singapore Airlines is going to operate a certain percentage more than July 19, which seems a bit out of kilter with the rest of the.
I think so.
So I think, you know, that's perhaps optimism for what was meant to be, certainly in the Australian context, Qantas's first planned restart to international services, which of course has been pushed back to October. And if you read media that's coming out now, it says that even then, you know, Qantas isn't informed about when the Australian government will let it fly again internationally, you know, in earnest. But certainly, you do see here the limitations from government sort of speaking to where airlines can fly to, and perhaps also where airlines have scheduled flights that are yet to be pulled out. If you look at the contrast between China Southern Airlines there insofar as July 21 and then Korean Airlines, I would guess in the next couple of weeks that might change considerably. And the same with Singapore Airlines, of course. And then conversely, if you look at the domestic volumes there with China Southern and China Eastern, no surprise there, huge numbers of travellers that can't go internationally and are turning inwards, and flying domestically within their country simply because they're able to, and there isn't any other choices elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So we wanted to also look at traditionally what the revenue mix has been for some of these carriers. So we've picked 4 here: China Southern, Japan Airlines, Singapore Airlines and Qantas, just to see how varied traditionally their revenue mix was in terms of what sort of markets it came from. So this looks at 2019 as a whole year, and you can see the sort of region pairs, whether it's intra-Asia, so Asia, or whether it's in Asia, North America, or quite where it comes from. Very different pattern of revenue generation across the different airlines. Obviously no surprise, but it does mean that as they start back up, the restrictions that will affect them all differently, doesn't it? Those that are most dependent on more local, more regional traffic will probably gain some of that revenue faster, doesn't it?
It does. And when I first looked at this very insightful data that you put together, Becca, I was just in awe at how Singapore Airlines had managed to have such a diversified revenue base. From from a normal risk assessment perspective, that would be a very strong position to be in. You're not over reliant on one market. You've got a lot of traffic coming from all areas of the globe. And of course, then it all goes terribly, terribly wrong in March of last year. But some of these have such huge reliance on regional markets, and it sort of plays to one of the comments someone has asked again. Regional capacity, regional demand is likely to return first. So for China Southern's, Japan Airlines and Qantas in the Southwest Pacific market, they're going to focus on those near to home destinations because that's where the opportunity and the cash will be.
And I think, as you say, Singapore Airlines 2 years ago would have thought that looked like a really diversified range of markets, but actually now we can see it as everything going through a hub, and that making the future quite uncertain, especially if travellers decide to use hubs a bit less. And Qantas, in contrast, the Tasman bubble actually plays very much to where their main market is, doesn't it?
Yeah, look,
Absolutely.
if you look at the large green segment there, 52%, that'll increase without doubt, because, Europe and North America in particular, they're basically will be almost close to zero, with only charter flights and freight being operated to and from those markets. Yeah, it's a good slide actually, because it does give perspective into those 4 carriers as to where they get their revenues from, and where they'll be crimped or expanded because the limitations on government policy about borders being opened or closed, or the restrictions that travellers face, denting confidence and wanting to travel.
And I think another interesting point here, Becca, is 3 of those 4 carriers have very large domestic market shares and domestic markets, and that in itself sort of points to one of the challenges these carriers are going to have, because as markets recover and an increasing proportion of their revenues come from those core markets, their desire to generate revenues from markets further afield may become less and less. Will some of these airlines, particularly airlines like China Southern, come back in any great way into the European China market? Will Japan Airlines operate as many services to Europe as they used to? will we see more code shares and joint ventures between alliance members? It will be fascinating to see how this all plays out in the next couple of years.
Okay, let's move on because we've still got a few more slides to go, and I would like to have some time for questions as well. We've got a not dissimilar slide, just quickly looking at the transatlantic. I know in this morning webinar we typically focus a bit more on Europe and Asia, but we've put this one in as well. Similar to ones we've seen before. This is transatlantic capacity, just looking at how that's changed over the 2 years between July 2019 and July 2021. Bearing in mind, as we've said already, there's probably more capacity in the July schedule than we expect to actually fly. But really, I was interested when I looked at this data. There were actually I'm looking for the wrong number.
49.
35% fewer airline seats in the schedule. There was a lot fewer, a quarter fewer airlines actually operating in the schedule, which means that the concentration of capacity amongst the big carriers is quite a bit more than it was.
Yeah, and you know, two very interesting slides on the bounce, Becca. This is great stuff. But I think what it also shows, and goes back to that first point I was making when we began, you know, it is an exciting period. We are going to see more routes. We are going to see more airlines established. But ultimately, I think we could end up in 4 or 5 years with actually more consolidation into the larger airlines, who will have, you know, had the more cash reserves, better balance sheets, been able to weather the storm, and be putting more capacity in and responding more effectively to the market. You know, those who've survived, and many of those carriers you have on that list, you know, are in a relatively strong position. I'm not sure I'd put Virgin Atlantic Airways in that context, and you know, we've lost Norwegian, but if you look at the balance sheets of British Airways and United and others, it's a very interesting future we will see on the North Atlantic. Although, of course, we have Norse Air, which you know, is coming back into the market. Interesting, isn't it?
Yes, I think, you know, in the last webinar we talked a lot about why we've seen so few airline failures, and actually, you know, so there's a lot of the airlines are still operating, and they're finding ways to get cash. But I thought this was really interesting that actually they must have just retrenched their networks very significantly. You know, to see a 25% fewer airlines actually operating these long haul routes is quite interesting. Okay, we said that we would talk a bit about network experimentation, which is one of the things that we've been observing and is happening more and more. So we've got some numbers here taken from OAG data where we've looked at how many routes have been added, and these are routes that haven't been operated for perhaps ever, or perhaps for a number of years. So we're seeing 1,400 new routes launched so far in the schedule in 2021. So really a much higher number than we've ever had before. I know, Matt, you were commenting about a comment made by the CEO of JetBlue, weren't you, about experimentation and risk. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, look, the airline was actually United, but you know, I think it's relevant for all of them. I'm sure they're all thinking it, and I know Alan Joyce has commented publicly about the fact that, you know, for instance, as an example, if the Australian government were to open its borders to Taiwan, which has had a very low number of cases and COVID indeed there, they would fly aircraft there, and this is the point that, in this case, the United Airlines was saying in a recent commentary, is that, you know, this is the perfect time to experiment with new routes and new flying, just simply because there will be pockets of demand in places that might not have been on the radar in the past, or perhaps were just under the cutoff insofar as you know, new route expansions or growing into new markets, whereby, you know, in some respects, the risk appetite is shortened, but still welcome in regards to starting these new routes and looking at ways that the pockets of demand can be served, and because there's a limitation on going elsewhere, and that's certainly what's transpiring down under here in the Tasman bubble, new markets are being opened by carriers, not necessarily new routes, but certainly carriers are serving new markets that they didn't serve in the past. And I personally think this will continue to happen for as long as there's restrictions in place, just so that airlines have this opportunity to chase revenues that they would have otherwise perhaps been slower to react to.
I think one of the things we need to also reflect on, Becca, is that when we look at new routes, sometimes we're looking and comparing to when new routes used to mean something like a daily flight from a destination to another point. Many of these are low frequency, maybe 2-3 times weekly services, which just goes to show how fragmented the market is going to become in the next probably year and a half as we work our way through this. Some of these will stick. Some of these will work and they will stimulate enough demand and they will stay, and others will unfortunately not survive. Or they may end up being served but via a hub rather than on a point-to-point basis, because the hub airports, still have a major role to play in the recovery. They're not going to go away.
I think the other thing to think about here is that the frequency reflects the market segment they're serving, which is predominantly leisure. In a lot of cases, not all of them, but a lot of them. There's certainly been some evidence elsewhere that the first markets to come back are leisure. Locally here right now, VFR tends to be the largest segment that seems to be pushing demand. Now that's down to, of course, the booking window that's been available insofar as the Tasman being able to be served two ways. For some listeners, they might not be aware that one-way travel from New Zealand to Australia has been open for the last 6 months. So when you talk to carriers on the Tasman, Qantas and Jetstar have had a spike in demand because passengers can go two-way. Carriers out of New Zealand, Air New Zealand, for instance, yes, they saw demand, but they already had a number of passengers, leaving New Zealand for Australia, knowing that they could easily do that, but with the restrictions, aware in the back of their mind that they'd have quarantine when they flew back into New Zealand. So I think the frequency element is true, John. I tend to agree. Will they stick? Who knows? But route and network planners at this stage are given a bit of a free pass, if you will, to try a few things, but not get too carried away. There's only so many failures that senior management will tolerate in this risk environment. And so in some respects, they'll be hoping a lot of these do stick when all elements of the market come back, education, business, VFR, leisure, or whatever might have come first, eventually comes around to actually being part of the market.
And Matt, that plays to an interesting point, doesn't it? Because a lot of these routes are going to be created and launched on the basis of community support, airport incentives, all of those types of things. And, that then should flow through and is intended to flow through to economic growth in each of those destinations. If a large proportion of that activity is in the VFR sector, which traditionally stays with friends, family and relatives, because that's what the segment is, then the economic impact of those services is actually significantly less than would perhaps have been the case if it was more of a business orientated service. So it's going to be fascinating to see how that all plays.
It does seem that there is an opportunity, though, isn't there, for your smaller, your regional airports who perhaps haven't been able to get the attention of an airline service until now because perhaps the airline doesn't have spare capacity, they're not going to experiment, they've got markets they're serving that are profitable. There is an opportunity now to say, well, actually try us and see if it works. And if that economic impact is there, then the community will see the benefit and perhaps be more willing to support that sort of route support process in future.
Yeah, I agree.
Interesting times, isn't it? So let's have a look at a few examples of where we're seeing a bit of network experimentation. On the left here, we've got Air New Zealand flying Auckland to Hobart. That's an interesting route, isn't it? And I was surprised to learn that it had never been operated before. Matt, I think you know a bit about this one, don't you?
Yeah, look, we've been involved in this one very early on, in fact, for almost a year now. And, you know, it has been almost 2 decades since Hobart was connected to New Zealand. And previously it was talking of frequency, a very low frequency flight between Hobart and Christchurch. Now that might seem odd to a lot of you, but in fact, what's interesting about those 2 cities is that they are both hubs for the Antarctic programs in both countries. So, you know, there's a lot of significant traffic between those 2 points, but not nearly enough as what we have today, or indeed 2019, between Auckland and Hobart. And I think the important thing to keep in mind here is the wider context. You know, why does Air New Zealand want to serve a market where in 2019 there are 20,000 passengers going between 2 points? Now, yes, it's about the O&D because that's where the most value is, and today that's quite simply one of the only fewer markets they can serve realistically. You know, there are other opportunities for them. For instance, you know, there's Townsville on the east coast, there's Canberra, there's Darwin, Alice Springs. You know, there's a host of other points they could serve, but lower volumes. And so I think the point here about Air New Zealand's network and flying to this point is about what's the bigger picture further down the track. When markets in North America open, and as I just said, the Antarctic program is the hub in Hobart, isn't that what it's all about? So in some respects, these low frequency flights, yes, they might be all about, you know, the leisure market today, but what are they going to be in tomorrow? And so in some respects, this story isn't about today necessarily. Yes, it's got to work or cut the mustard, wash its face, if you will, all those different descriptions. But what's the future look for in this market, and why are they doing that? And so I think the story and the discussion between destinations, airports and airlines, that wonderful trinity, is that where is the value in the longer term, but also in the short term? And it's about building the story around being applicable now, but also well into the future.
Really interesting. Thanks very much, Matt. On the right, we've got an example from United. You could see in the red lines, certainly as they went into the winter season, they added lots of new routes to Florida. And now we're seeing a whole range of additional new routes, which are sort of a bit more Midwest and some of the hubs. This is a lot of new air services, John, isn't it?
It is, but you know what, Becca, it also tells you how much spare capacity they had in their fleet to be able to do this as a result of COVID. And a big focus and concentration on their hubs, as you would expect. You know, that's absolutely vital, and it gives them the critical mass with all of the connecting flows. But they were first out of the blocks amongst the legacy carriers in the US in terms of adding these almost unique city pairs, and it will be interesting to see whether these are still here in 12 months' time. I suspect they will be. They may be lower frequent, you know, they may continue on a low frequency, but if it avoids hubs for some travelers, then there might even be a yield premium to be had on that non-stop as opposed to the one stop via somewhere else.
We've had a question in about these using smaller, more efficient aircraft. A lot of these services are sort of 50-seat regional jet operations, aren't they? They're not large aircraft.
No, and you know that's where they have quite a bit of capacity at the moment, and it's their regional partners and affiliates that are operating these services on their behalf. So from their perspective, it's almost a fixed cost operation. It's the cost is normally per ASK, so you know, as long as they're breaking even and they can do a little bit of revenue management on it, they're probably covering the cost of the operation.
Right.
And just on that question, actually, I think you know, to extend it even further, you know, the likes of the A220 and the A321XLR and other sort of variants, you know, from both major manufacturers, I think they're going to become incredibly popular going forward because people will want this point-to-point choice. Yes, the hubs will continue to be important just simply because they have the, you know, the volume flow, but you know, people will want this point-to-point convenience, which will, that, you know, airports and destinations will need to think more broadly around, well, you know, this was a small market, but, you know, what could it be? And what, you know, other options are there for development further down the track when, you know, things.
Matt, sorry, I was going to say the A220 and you know, someone like Air Baltic, and I know Becca's a fan of the A220.
I'm a fan of the 220, yes.
Plenty of legroom for you, isn't it, Becca? But more importantly, you know, it can do a Riga Dubai sector just as well as it can do a Riga Edinburgh sector, which they've just announced. So I think you're spot on. You know, that type of aircraft size with the range is going to be extremely popular for the next couple of years, and Delta's got them, and I'm sure they'll be making quite a lot of use of it.
Okay, we've got another example to look at, which is Wizz Air. So Wizz are undergoing huge network churn, it seems. We've our little table on the left here shows, we did some analysis to see in each year since 2017, how many routes have they stopped flying and how many have they started as new versus the previous year. And you can see just a lot of churn, just getting faster and faster, and, you know, massive number of new routes last year and this year, but also still a number that were stopped. So the chart on the right shows the routes that are new in the schedules this year. A lot of Scandinavia, that's all new, isn't it, for them, John?
Yeah, and that's you know, an opportunistic play. And one of the things that Wizz do better than many others is, you know, take advantages of opportunities very quickly. In this case, playing on the geographic challenges of Norway, the large domestic market, the, you know, almost meltdown of Norwegian, and a gap that was created. I think the other fascinating thing here in the network map, Becca, is in the far bottom right-hand corner where you see Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. And if I was a network planner, I would at some point in Wizz Air be thinking those points are going to be joined to points somewhere in Central Europe as well. It's, you know, it's an inevitable play as part of their development. I mean, Matt, you've got experience of Wizz from your Norwegian experiences.
Yeah, look, you know, I think you're absolutely spot on. You know, these airlines in particular that have the capacity to take aircraft and purchase them will look for points where they can, you know, join the dots, so to speak, which is a common phrase. But, you know, certainly this is a interesting slide because it begins to show you that, you know, a carrier that wants to stick to a certain type of model or range of aircraft will want to try and develop those networks wholesale, you know, where they can.
Okay, very interesting. We're going to jump back. I know we've talked a few times about the Tasman bubble. We've got a slide showing what that's going to look like. So it starts from the 19th of April, though, as you say, Matt, we've had some services till now. So there's here on the left, we've got a week of the 19th, and then a few more services coming on stream a little bit later. Cairns will be included, and they're just a bit more service. Virgin Australia not participating though, so that's just that they don't have the capacity to join it at the moment, isn't it?
Look, it's mainly around an aircraft acquisition story. You know, they got rid of quite a few aircraft, and I think they're playing safe as well. You know, the key in this, of course, is certainty around travel, and up until, you know, a week ago, there wasn't much certainty at all. So I think they're just playing safe to do so, and also, as I said, they've got rid of so many aircraft through voluntary administration that's left them a bit unable to service the Tasman in the short term, but they are having flights scheduled from September into Queenstown in particular. A lot of destinations or airlines that touch Queenstown tend to make good money, being a very iconic destination to visit. And then later on in the year, they'll add more capacity, and I assume once they get those aircraft sorted, I see the Hobart's missing off the list there, but these schedules are very dynamic, but that's okay. And Cairns and Gold Coast to Auckland, those two cities in Australia serving are connected with Auckland already with different carriers, but on this occasion, Qantas is jumping into the market, which is not entirely surprising, being a premium brand compared to Jetstar, which is your value brand. Qantas serving Cairns and to the Gold Coast, both markets are high volume markets, or as Qantas is serving Cairns seasonally, a seasonal opportunity to capture a high yielding market that can't go to the south of France in the summer. There's a lot of New Zealanders and Australians that love to visit Europe and North America during our cooler winter months, and of course that's not going to be available for New Zealanders. The furthest north you can get is Northern Australia, so Cairns will be a popular choice for those New Zealanders that can't get their share of winter sun.
Yeah, we've pulled some data about where Australians and New Zealanders, well, it's not the traffic, this is just traffic flows between Australia on the left and various markets in 2019, and then the same for New Zealand on the right, just seeing what were the biggest flows from each of those countries, which is a good indication of where people were going. And as you say, if the Australians were going to Bali before, where are they going to go now? Is it all going to be Cairns? Are we going to see 3.3 million visits to Cairns?
Let's make this clear. This is travel volume, so it's not actually the number of citizens from either country total. So 3.3 is a little too high. It's about 1.3 million Australians went to Bali in 2019, and that is the largest outbound visitor market from Australia. It is a significant market, Indonesia as a total, and so when you have those significant volumes, closed off for 12 months, 24 months, who really knows what the end date would be, but for certainly a lot of Australians, they will be itching to get somewhere where they can have a similar experience, and maybe that is Cairns, or maybe it's Fiji, or maybe it's somewhere else where they can get to. And that's why pockets of demand, when they're available to be traveled to, could be very appealing to a lot of people who have not been able to have their experience outside their home country.
So we'd expect to see some of those Pacific Islands do quite well perhaps over the next year, but they don't have the capacity, do they, to take anywhere near this sort of volume. So they don't
have the product, Becca, do they? I mean, some of the enshrined reasons for going to places like Bali are not exactly the same sort of product offering that you'll see in some of the Pacific Islands.
Correct.
And that the room rate and the room cost is much higher in some of those islands than you can get in places in Southeast Asia. So I think it's really, really difficult to see what's going to happen here. That pent-up demand is going to be so large that at some point it will explode out. It's like a boil waiting to burst. And there is this whole thing about domestic destination wear out, however hard you try, and we're seeing this in China. Market feedback is Chinese nationals are getting a little bit bored of being restricted to just going to Chinese destinations. They want to experience different cultures. They want to see, iconic locations, excepting, of course, that some will not want to go because of the crowds. But we're going to have to see outbound travel come back quickly. And for both Australia and New Zealand, they are further behind the curve perhaps than many other countries, because total lockdown is total lockdown, and you can't just open the doors, or you're reluctant to open the doors.
Yep.
So we've got one more slide to look at, and that was, we just wanted to have a quick look at China, Australia, because that's been such a big market in recent years for Australia in particular, and we've seen a huge growth in airlines and in routes operated, admittedly mostly Chinese carriers flying back and forth. There's obviously a little bit of trickiness between China and Australia at the moment, but we think generally that this market will come back, won't we? you know, with VFR drives quite a lot of that, and that, you know, there's such a large population of Chinese people or people of Chinese origin in Australia that those connections which drive a lot of travel will remain, won't they?
Yeah, look, I'll jump in here, John, if that's okay. I do. I do see this market coming back. You know, I've explained to some other you know, interested parties that the way I sort of look at this is, you know, the politics involved are like parents squabbling, and the children in the meantime will continue to play, and that's what I think will happen, because to some extent a lot of vested interest is in Australia. There are significant pockets of diaspora in the different cities. And, you know, yes, they will continue to have those family connections. So I do see these, you know, city pairs coming back. Perhaps they won't come back all at the same time on day one, but they will certainly come back, because there is an affinity with Australia that Chinese travellers enjoy experiencing. It's the lifestyle and other sorts of attractions that Australia offers, and so the product here is well favoured by that market. But I think also, you know, the Australian destinations that are listed here on the map around the east, you know, around the seaboard, will also need to be active in ensuring that they can't assume it will all come back. And I think those that spend time in the Chinese market, and indeed Asian markets, and it's particularly more important, I feel, in Asian markets than it is in Western markets, where you have this FaceTime or Guangxi, the way in which you develop those relationships, which unfortunately, you know, over technology isn't easily maintained or crafted from the start. So I do think it will be traffic that will come back eventually.
It's there's a lot going on and a lot of capacity to come back here, isn't there? It's just, I think this slide just rams home how important China is, not just to Australia, but to every regional market in Southeast and Northeast Asia, in terms of the capacity and the frequency that it will rebuild over time. And, you know, all of the hesitancy about China and all of those sort of things, as soon as they're able to, I'm sure Chinese travellers will be back out in all of these countries, on the golf courses, in the shops, on the beaches, behaving like they did 2 years ago.
Yep.
That's really great. Thanks, both of you, Matt and John. We're coming towards the end of our webinar today. We try to take questions as we've gone through, so hopefully we haven't left you with too many burning questions. John, Matt, do you have any sort of final thoughts of where we are at the moment, middle of April 2021?
I haven't a clue, Becca. It depends what side of bed you get out of every morning.
Okay.
Optimistic or pessimistic. Only time will tell, I'm afraid.
We're still wanting a bit more clarity from governments, I think. That's been your message.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, governments have got to get hold of this, and they've got to start giving us more clarity as an industry, because at the moment, you know, I mean, certainly in the UK, I think in the whole of Europe, we are just desperate for some guidance and some leadership. You know, that's what we voted for and we're not getting.
Matt, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, look, I'm going to be on the opposite side. You know, with New Zealand opening up next week, I think there will be some pent-up demand and some great stories around people reconnecting, which is fantastic. But also, it'll give confidence to both markets. And as governments learn from this opening up, then other markets, I think, bilaterally will also open up, which, you know, gradually will be a story that I think probably runs in tandem with the vaccine programs in both countries, and indeed a lot of others that they'll end up probably bilaterally joining. But, you know, speed is important here, and certainly the vaccine program being rolled out at a faster pace would be very, very welcome. But certainly certainty for travellers, being able to book markets and travel to markets that were once closed, will allow airlines to recover at a faster pace.
That's great. Thank you both very much for all your thoughts and insights today. That's been really excellent. We'll be back with the next OAG webinar on Wednesday, the 19th of May. So please join us then, and do sign up for John's blog and all the other information that you can get from OAG in terms of the coronavirus recovery. Thanks very much for joining us. Bye then.
Thank you.